what I want to do with this class is locate those of us who have late period personas in the time period where we would be living. We, as reenactors, are quite excellent at digging into the material culture of the people that we are investigating and recreating, stepping into their shoes in what they would have worn or what they would have fought with. But we're less invested in figuring out what the people that we recreate would have thought, how they would have felt, what they would have seen as their place in history. And so that's the idea of the story of the late Middle Ages. If I asked you who were the influential leaders of the 20th century, we would say Teddy Roosevelt, King George, the Kaiser, Lenin, Churchill, Hitler, Stalin, Eisenhower, Mao, Khrushchev, Nixon, Gorbachev, Reagan. These people created the landscape. And I don't necessarily subscribe to the great man theory of history, but they were like the pinnacles of mountains that everybody saw. And they, by knowing the people and what they did and having the idea of their personalities, you get an understanding of the flavor of the era. And you can figure out the most interesting bits to reenact. So I want to do that for the medieval period. We'll start our story of the late Middle Ages at the end of the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages was that romantic orphan period that we don't recreate very often in the SCA. It's very beloved of the Victorians, because the Victorians were looking at the beautiful history, the beautiful deeds that happened in the High Middle Ages, whereas we so often look at the beautiful things that we can reenact and have for ourselves and wear and fight with. The 13th century, the end of the High Middle Ages, saw the glories of an earlier age in a stately but inevitable decline. The Normans finished when Philip of Anjou took Normandy away from the Plantagenets. By the end of his life, Henry Plantagenet, Henry Fitzimpress, father of Richard the Lionhearted, King John, the father, Henry Fitzimpress, had alienated his sons, his wife, his friends, his liege lord, and he tried to take on the whole damn world himself. Of course, he lost. And with that loss, when he permanently had to relinquish claim to Normandy, to the French crown, was really the biggest nail in the coffin at the end of Normans as a distinct people and an international power. Because Normans, the Northmen who became Christian and settled and conquered, well, quite a lot of Europe, had been forced in England, had been forced in France, had been forced in the Mediterranean, they took in Sicily, they took in southern Italy, they had most of the Crusader states to their name, and by the end of the 13th century, they're gone. They're not Norman anymore. They are Frenchmen, they're Englishmen, they are Sicilian, they're Italian. The Crusader states, at the end of the High Middle Ages, were lost to the Seljuk Turks. The Normans had fought well against the Egyptian Saracens, but the Mongol horde displaced the Turks, who in turn displaced the Ayyubid Empire and very quickly dominated the region. Emperor Frederick II, Stuparmundi, actually went on crusade. He was excommunicated at the time. That was why he went on crusade. He actually went and he took back Jerusalem, and they held it for 20 years. But it fell again. Antioch was the last Crusader state to fall. By 1290, it was gone. The Latin Empire had come and gone. The Venetians had persuaded the Crusaders to sack Constantinople, which was their primary naval and economic rival, and put a Catholic emperor on the throne. And it seemed like a good idea at the time. But they were attacked on all sides by Orthodox rebels at home, by Bulgarians in the west, Egyptian coastal raiders, and Eastern Roman imperials in Asia Minor. 50 years later, the city had fallen to a tenth of its previous population. And Michael Paleologos, who was the most noble man in Greece, and you might recognize the Paleologos name as the name of the emperors succeeding, he managed to retake the city because he convinced the Genoans, the Venetians' other naval and economic rival, to sponsor him, and he and his son rebuilt. Constantinople never fully recovered because in the intervening years, the Turks had invaded and they'd taken Asia Minor and conquered their economic base. This was, by the way, the humble beginning of the Ottoman Empire, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit because that wasn't a 13th century thing. Even the Holy Roman Empire, which by mid-13th century had swollen to its greatest extent since Charlemagne, it had deflated, been shot full of holes by competing interests and angry popes. Frederick Stupermundi was powerful enough to conquer Italy, reconquer Jerusalem, defy two popes, shrug off excommunication twice, have a harem of 4 wives and 7 known mistresses. His 20 sons pulled the empire apart at the seams, squabbling for their peace. And the Pope and the landed German Hochadel, the high nobles, were happy to cheer them on. They were happy to do without an emperor for 20 years. And when one was finally crowned, the empire was weak with little prestige or power. They crowned a compromise candidate, Heinrich VII, a young Count of Luxembourg. He was a small fish in deep waters, but he was vigorous, he was politically savvy. He maneuvered quite a few of the big fish into rebuilding Frederick II's dream. He campaigned into Italy, which at that time was a vicious cesspool of spies, poisoners, blood feuds. Italy was divided into the Guelph and the Ghibelline faction, depending on how they felt about the Holy Roman Empire. But that had been relevant 150 years prior. But by that time, it just was a label to tell you whether you stabbed this person in the back or in the front. When Heinrich came in, and again, this is still the 13th century, he was almost a messianic figure. He threw out ruling Italian nobles. He treated both factions with respect. He restored imperial rule. It would have never lasted, but no one ever got the chance to find out because he died of malaria 3 years into his reign as emperor, and the empire slowly fell into shambles again. Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, he wrote about Heinrich and the golden throne that awaited him for his good works. He was a prophet come to save Italy before she was ready. The rest of Europe had similar stories. England had Simon de Montfort. He was the famous crusader. He was the brother-in-law to the English king. He led a popular uprising in England to restore the protections guaranteed by Magna Carta from the royal abuses of his brother-in-law. But he was fighting against his nephew, Edward Longshanks, Edward I, the same guy from Braveheart, who utterly conquered Wales and suppressed the Scots, and Longshanks won. Simon de Montfort would have been sainted had it not been that he was the direct enemy of a crowned king, and the popes thought that was impolitic. There is still a move to get Simon de Montfort sainted today. Unfortunately, England is not a Catholic country, so they don't have high political priority in Rome. All through the High Middle Ages, Europe had a chance at peace, or at least greatness, within its grasp, and then it fumbled the grip, or put back down again. So, what's the cutoff between the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages? Well, that was when the Lamb opened the 7 seals and sent down the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Because that was exactly how the people at the time saw it. Started with the Black Horse. Plague. 1315. No, excuse me. Black Horse is famine. 1315, 2 years after Emperor Heinrich died. 20 years after the fall of Jerusalem, Europe experienced an unusually heavy rainfall. Throughout the spring and summer, it continued to rain. Temperatures remained cool. This led to crop failures, but it was not bad. You can handle a bad year. There was no fodder for the livestock because the hay couldn't be cured in the rain. The price of food began to rise. Food prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. By winter, food was 3 times as expensive. The winter was unusually harsh. Emergency stores were eaten. It was pretty bad. This was the end of the medieval warm period and the very beginning of the Little Ice Age. Next year, the rains kept coming. People existed on seeds and roots. Everything on 4 legs had been killed. Cows, pigs, horses, oxen, dogs, cats, rats, frogs, mice. Edward II, King of England, stopped at St. Albans. In August, no bread could be found for the king. There was nothing. Nobody had anything left. Society completely broke down. You think about preparing for the zombie apocalypse. That was kind of a fun thing a couple of years ago. Try preparing for this. People turned to banditry in mass numbers because anybody who had anything had more than you did. If they didn't have anything, well, people were made of meat. It was so bad, grandparents voluntarily stopped eating so that their grandchildren could survive and their children ate them. Parents abandoned their children. You know the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel? Parents abandon their children in the woods. They run away while the children are sleeping. Then the children find their way to a house in the woods where a woman takes them in and feeds them sweets in order to fatten them up and eat them. That happened. That was a real thing that happened during the Great Famine. This was the Great Famine. 10% of the total population died of starvation. That would be 2 of us in here. In cities, it was more like 25%. In Italy and Greece were spared, as it happened. The inclement weather did not reach there because it was stopped by the Alps and the Carpathians. They were protected from all that rainfall. The merchant princes in Italy in later periods got their start right here. They were selling Mediterranean grain to all of Western Europe at 10 times the price, and they made fortunes. The Byzantines did the exact same thing. And along with the fortunes, they made enemies. You know why in later periods no one raised a finger to help Constantinople fight off the Turks? It started right here. Because the people in Western Europe looked at the Greeks as backstabbing merchant usurers who turned their back on their fellow Christians, despite being, the Orthodox Catholic divide. Despite that, they were still supposed to be Christians, all banding together against the enemy, and they watched Europe starve and made money on it, and so they said, "Screw you all," and left them to their fate. The famine lasted for 2 years. Starvation lasted for 5. It took 15 years for food production to return to normal. It took 20 years for the population to return to its previous level. Then came the Pale Horse, the plague. 10 years after the recovery of the Great Famine, the Black Plague came to Europe. And then a quarter of the population died. I think we're all pretty familiar with the Black Plague. I don't need to rehash it here. But just realize that a child who was born in the Great Famine, or a child who was born who wouldn't have survived in the Great Famine, a child who was maybe 5 for the Great Famine, would have been about 20 when the plague happened. And then after the plague was war. Because shortly after that, the 100 Years' War split Western Europe down the middle. It was a war made more brutal by the brutality of the age. The only way, France was a European superpower. It was the superpower of the Middle Ages. In fact, later on, the Europeans would write fantasies about once Constantinople fell, and the rest of Europe went, "Ooh, that was a mistake." They wrote fanfics, historical fiction about what could have happened, what could have been. Oh, if only a brave company of French knights went down to Constantinople, they could have turned the tide against the Turk. And it might have actually happened. There are certain points where 1,000 French knights absolutely would have changed the course of the war. It could have happened. It was not ignorant fantasy. But France, that is saying how powerful France and French knights were seen by the rest of Europe. The only way that England could have a hope of conquering France was by not conquering it at all. They split off disaffected nobles, and then embarked in the chevauchée, which is not guerrilla warfare. That's wrong. It's more like economic warfare. The idea of the chevauchée was very much like MacArthur's plan of hit them where they ain't. The French, when they assembled, were unconquerable, except for with a few very notable exceptions, which the English and we, because we're Anglophones, still celebrate today. Crécy and Poitiers are notable even now because there were huge upsets. It was a tremendously lopsided battle. It shouldn't have gone that way. Agincourt even more. The way that the English were conquering France was by starving the French, by pillaging the countryside. If the peasants have nothing, then they will turn on the people who have something. Not necessarily on the people who took it from them, but on the people who still have something. And the French nobility are going to be bogged down, restoring peace and order in their lands, dispersing the French army so that the English army, which is still concentrated, can hit the French crown. That was the plan, and it worked. But it also meant that Western Europe was hell for anyone below the rank of a titled noble. Even the knights, it was still hell. And then on the outskirts of Europe, the White Horse. In 1299, a Turk named Osman, which is the Turkish variation of the Muslim name Uthman, came with his father's tribe out of what is now Kazakhstan, fleeing the Mongols. They settled near Nicaea, You've heard of the Nicene Creed? That came out of the Council of Nicaea, which is a Greek city in what is now Turkey. They pledged loyalty to the Seljuk Turks, and his father became a bey, or a chieftain. Osman made a name for himself as a brave warrior. They called himself Kara, with a black, which means northern, which also means tough. It's in Eastern cultures, and this is pretty much universal in Asia. Let's see. Black is north, white is west, red is south, blue is east. So if you hear about the white Huns or the blue Turks, they're telling you where they're from. But each of those also has characteristics associated with it. Like we even have characteristics associated with the cardinal directions today. Like, oh, he's very Western. And that means like emotional and personality characteristics, right? Northern. Like that means something, even to us. So it did to them too. So he was called the Black. As an adult, Osman had religious experience. He dreamed that the branches of his family tree would shadow the whole world. He married the daughter of a famous sheikh. He fought the Byzantines and took as much of their land as he could. When the time was right, he declared independence from the Seljuk Turks. He called himself an emir, and his nation was the Ottoman Emirate. His son and grandson concentrated on conquering all of Anatolia from the Byzantines, who were helpfully involved in a civil war. And they were very successful at it. Also, they called the land that they occupied Rome. They called it Rome, much like the Visigoths and Visigoth and Ostrogoth, and the Gothic and Vandal occupiers of the Western Roman Empire. They took over sections of Rome, but they didn't destroy it. They wanted Rome to be Rome. They just wanted to rule it. They sent their children to Romans to be educated. They brought Romans into their court to issue correct laws. They brought Romans in to teach them their art and then had them do it what they wanted in a Roman style. They very much tried to adopt the best of Rome, just put themselves at the top. And the Ottomans tried to do exactly the same thing. That's why it was called, you've heard of the Sultanate of Rome? That's them. But that was Osman's doing. They were very successful because they adopted the then unique practice of fostering all orphans from the war-torn territories. They brought them in, they gave them homes, they converted the boys to Islam, and trained them as a standing army of well-paid infantry. These were the Janissaries. It was a completely new form of warfare. They were obliged to serve. So in a way, they were captive, like the Mamluk slaves in Egypt. And like the Mamluks, they were elite soldiers with high social status and authority, but they weren't eunuchs. They were able to extend their high social status to their family members and pass their social status on, which was big. As an orphan, that's how the Ottoman Empire converted and consumed the Byzantine Empire that withstood the Saracens and other Seljuk Turks for so long. The Ottomans ran into a slight problem in the 1330s, but they got off a lot easier than the Seljuk Turks they were fighting. That problem was named Timur Beg Gurkhani, a Turk-Mongol from Uzbekistan. He killed 5% of the world's population. He was seen as an ally to Europe because he killed the shit out of traditional European enemies. We know him as Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, Tamerlane, the scourge of God. So Europe, at the beginning of the late Middle Ages, is slammed with disaster after disaster after disaster that seem to correspond directly to the four horsemen of the apocalypse. How do people respond to this? In one of two ways, basically. Well, three. The first is depression. And there was a great deal of that. The second is with religious fanaticism. Very much so. But unlike earlier religious fanaticism, like we see outpourings of religious fanaticism in the late 10th century as the millennium approaches. People were scourging themselves, repenting for their sins, praying for salvation from the coming apocalypse, which did not come. Religious fanaticism at this time looked like a distrust in the church and the corruption that people could see in the nobility, because the disasters befell the whole world and no one was spared. Therefore, it was obvious that the whole world was sinful and no one was righteous, because the righteous would be spared, logically. So you see attacks against the nobility, attacks against the authority of the church. You see novel expressions of religious fundamentalism that ultimately culminated in the Protestant Reformation. The seeds of later, much later Reformation and the split away from the Catholic Church were rooted in the seed of disbelief that was planted because of God outpouring his wrath on the world at the beginning of the 14th century. The other way that people responded was by becoming libertine. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And this actually started a social movement that was big in the 14th and 15th centuries, of dividing yourself, self-identifying, which would be either what they called the party of the leaf or the party of the flower. If you were a leaf, you were there to plant seeds, to grow trees. You were there to invest in the future because you thought there would be a future. You were socially conservative. You were, let's say, abstinent and temperate. Whereas if you were a flower, you weren't so sure that there was going to be a future. And so you were very libertine. You looked for love wherever you could find it. You did not save. You spent profligately. And we can see the evidence of people's affiliations on their clothing and on their armor. If you look, leaves are a very common pattern on armor. But so are flowers. They were telling you they're essentially their political, no, not political, that's wrong. Their social affiliation. Like they were telling you how they thought about life, whether they put leaves or flowers, or sometimes both, because, you know, there are some who try to walk a middle way. Where are we? So it's useful, especially if you're doing 14th century. If you're thinking, playing somebody who is in the 100 Years' War, just realize that their childhood was spent in plague and famine, and that shaped the people they were as they executed this war. Or if they're later in the 100 Years' War, they grew up in a lifetime of war. And that shaped who they are and how they treated their opponents. Even though they were still holding to the chivalric ideal that had been formed in earlier centuries of treating the highborn with respect, it doesn't always play out that way. You read a number of exchanges in the 100 Years' War where people are treated with respect and taken as captives as they would have been a century earlier. But you also see accounts where, they died by a dagger to the eye slot. And there was no quarter taken. There was an old knight, I don't remember his name. This was after the Battle of Poitiers. And it was written that the young knights were watching as bodies were dragged, and then their eyes were stabbed. They were stabbed under the armpits so that they could be stripped of their belongings, and prisoners were executed, and it was horrible. And so it was written in the book in the history. I think this was in Francois' Chronicles. It was written that the young knights kept to themselves and looked away and stayed at the side of the field. And then an old knight said, "Are ye maidens, or are ye warriors? Look ye well upon the stricken field, for this is the fate of defeat." And you can see on the one hand, yes, it is a older knight telling the young knights exactly what they need to do to be men of action, be men of war. But on the other hand, you can see how the brutality of the age shaped that older knight, because that's not something that somebody 100 years before would have said. William Marshall was probably the best knight in the Middle Ages, did not speak that way. He talked much more of chivalry and gentility. Now let's talk about some of the figures, the great men of history. Even though it's not necessary that they shaped history, history certainly shaped itself around them. Henry V, after the 100 Years' War of England, he was the son of a usurper. He was the grandson of the Duke of Lancaster, who founded the House of Lancaster, who was the youngest brother of the Black Prince. He is the great-grandson of Edward III, one of the greatest kings of England, arguably the rightful heir of France. The French will say, no, we've always had, it's not primogeniture. What is the inheritance through the male line? It has its own name. Doesn't matter. Always had inheritance through the male line. But the reality is that they developed that as a formal legal precedent. They formalized the legality of that in response to Edward III's claim on the French throne. Henry all but conquered France at Agincourt in 1415. Later campaigns consolidated his victory. It didn't end at Agincourt, even though Shakespeare would have us believe that. He was aided by French instability, by infighting in the royal family, the French royal family. It was so bad that the prince, the Dauphin, had his cousin, John the Fearless of Duke of Burgundy, murdered in broad daylight in the streets of Paris. Burgundy was the most powerful noble in France, arguably more powerful than the king. And because of that murder, his son, Philip the Good, the new duke, became Henry V's most ardent supporter. This was the cause of the alliance between Burgundy, which at the time was all of Western France, all of Eastern France, and England. With Burgundy's support, Henry was named heir to the French throne, married into the royal family, and that should have been the end of it. But Henry died 5 years later, leaving a toddler to inherit the throne. And the Dauphin decided he did not want to play fiddle to an English 4-year-old when he restarted the war. It went badly, very badly. He was getting creamed. It was glorious. That Dauphin was an absolute scumbag. Until a little French girl from Orleans had a vision and told her to reconquer France from the English. Jeanne d'Arc. The Maid of Orleans was spoken to by God, or at least she and 2/3 of France and half of Western Europe believed she had been. And she did indeed conquer France back from the English in the name of God and her king, but despite her death, burned at the stake when the Burgundians managed to have her declared a heretic, she was a very staunch and loyal daughter and defender of the church, and she was perfectly prepared to go to war against those who were not. Specifically, over in Hungary, the followers of Jan Hus. Jan Hus, if you've heard of Hussites, Hungarian Hussites, were the followers of Jan Hus. He was a Hungarian priest and an advocate of reform in the church. He condemned the corruption of priests, corruption of prelates, even the corruption of the Pope. Remember when he would have been a young man? He would have been a young man in the famine. He would have been an adult going through the plague. He became an elder of the church during the middle of the 100 Years' War, or towards the end of the 100 Years' War. Shaped his perceptions, quite a lot. And he advocated serving communion to the laity, that's all of us, which was a big deal, because at the time there was no question in people's minds that the bread and the wine were transubstantiated into the literal body and blood of Jesus Christ. And you don't go giving that to people who don't understand or don't care about the significance. At least that was the prevailing view at the time. So at the time, it was the priest who consumed the Eucharist on behalf of the people. The Eucharist was not served to the laity. And Jan Hus disagreed with that, as did most Hungarians. Also, he was a heretic. He was. He believed things that were explicitly contrary to the text of the Bible. He professed to be a Christian. He called it heresy. But it was a very minor heresy. It was like the Filioque controversy. It caused the schism between the Orthodox and Latin churches. It's Filioque means and of the Son. So is the origin of the Holy Spirit from the Father or from the Father and the Son? So does it create the Holy Spirit, or is the Holy Spirit equivalent to Christ, or is he the junior member of the Trinity? And that's the origin of the split between Orthodox and Catholics. Ain't that big? So it didn't matter. Jan Hus was slightly heretical. It was a minor point of interpretation. He was well loved by the people, and the church had him burned at the stake. In response, the people and the nobles of Hungary took up arms and threw out their temporal and spiritual overlords and established essentially the first Protestant kingdom. That did not go over well with the ousted overlords, including their king, Sigismund, who had just defeated an Ottoman invasion with the help of John the Fearless of Burgundy, that was murdered on the streets of Paris. Sigismund saved most of Eastern Europe from slavery and forced conversion, so he came out does seem a little bit ungrateful. In response, they declared a crusade. 3 of them, actually. The reason there were 3 of them is because the Hungarians kicked ass. They took names. They did that because they had generals like Jan Žižka, who they called Old One Eye. He had fought with the Polish and Lithuanians against the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald, where the Knights were defeated and eliminated as a major European power. He understood very well how to fight cavalry. He created what the Germans called Wagenburg, a wagon castle. It was a mobile fortress made of armored wagons filled with crossbowmen and burly peasants with 2-handed flails. They slaughtered every army that came at them. And his followers started calling themselves Taborites. They set up a commune and dedicated them to establishing the equality of man and killing all nobles. And the nobles who were on their side were like, wait, what? And the Taborites were like, you heard us. So the revolution fell apart. The last crusade won. They killed all the commies. The king got his country back. The Hungarians were allowed to take communion, and the rest of Europe learned to walk very softly around Hungary for a while. Takeaway is never kill the reformers, because then you have to deal with the radicals. The things that go on in Hungary, Poland, Romania, which was also Bohemia, and Wallachia, and then was totally swallowed by the Ottoman Empire, and then was unswallowed, they can often seem like a sideshow to what goes on in Western Europe, and the Western Europeans thought so too. Even the people who lived there thought so too, because nation-states appear and disappear every 50 years. They had no narrative of who they were as a people. They were the followers of this noble and his personal life path. Or they were just the people who lived here, and we've always lived here. But this one, the Hussite Rebellion, was such a big deal that Joan of Arc wrote a letter to Jan Žižka and said, you all better get right with the church and accept your nobles again, because if you don't, if I ever get a break from the English wars, they called them the English wars, I'm coming over there raising an army and making holy war on your asses.
Right.
We actually have that letter. It's pretty cool. And it's very likely that those were her words that was dictated. We do not believe she was literate, but the text was written so plainly that it almost had to be the actual words of that young woman who was leading an army, because it was quite blunt. Of course, Joan died before that could ever happen. But the Hungarians remembered that. And for the rest of the 15th century, the Hungarians were the allies of the English against France. I know. And so were the Burgundians. The Dauphin, who later became the thoroughly forgettable Charles VII, may have reclaimed France once Joan of Arc handed it to him on a platter. But Philip the Good did not forget that he'd had his father murdered. So while the English were losing their hold on France, he consolidated Burgundy. He established borders, essentially became his own little country. And to establish his legitimacy in the eyes of his peers, his court very quickly became the most magnificent, the most opulent, and well-respected in Europe. The fashions of Burgundy set fashion all over Europe. Even Italy and Poland felt its influence. If you want to dress well in the 15th century, you dress Burgundy. Philip the Good reigned for 48 years. Under him, Burgundy became staggeringly prosperous and one of the most wealthy states in Europe. That is something we in the modern world never experienced, the stability and constancy of a monarch. A bad monarch can destroy a country, but a good monarch can create and shepherd prosperity in a way that would never be possible in a democracy. And the effects of both can be felt for generations. 48 years is a long time. But he had other contemporaries who reigned just as long or longer. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III was on the throne for 53 years. They called him Frederick the Peaceful, because he discovered early on in life that he was bad at fighting wars. So he did. His first war was against his brother Albert, who was as active and ambitious as Frederick was patient and methodical. They fought for 4 years, and Albert won every battle. So Frederick let him have everything he wanted. Then Albert died a year later, childless, and Frederick got everything that he had and more. He made a habit of outliving his enemies and picking up their pieces. He assumed so many territories that he was forced to move his royal court from city to city, which had been a fashionable practice 200 years ago. But by this time, Europe had capital cities, and business was expected to be conducted in the capital. But his territory was so large that was impossible. So he had an itinerant court, the same way that, like, Richard the Lionhearted did. The years of peace and quiet victories made the empire tremendously prosperous and made Frederick an immovable figure on the European landscape. But it wasn't like there were no conflicts. In fact, he fought Philip the Good over the Duchy of Savoy. It had been part of the empire. Philip had integrated it into his unified Burgundy. There were a few sieges back and forth to settle the matter one way or the other. And the last time they fought, Frederick won big enough that he forced Philip to promise the hand of his daughter Mary to Frederick's son Maximilian, who would later become Emperor Maximilian the last night. It was one of those happy accidents of dynastic politics. It was a purely political marriage, but it turned into one of the great love matches of European history. Mary and Maximilian adored each other, and for almost 10 years they did everything together. They wrote letters together, they spent time reading together, they administered their lands together, they went riding together, they went hunting together, they were inseparable. Mary died while she was out hunting with her husband, and she was thrown from a horse and pinned underneath it. It took her 3 days to die. Maximilian mourned her for the rest of his life. They had a son named Philip, after his grandfather, who was the heir to all of Burgundy. He was the heir to Burgundy because his uncle, Charles the Bold, had rekindled his father's sporadic war against the French crown. Charles was indeed bold, and he blazed a trail across half of France. He was a brilliant soldier, brilliant administrator. He was tremendously wealthy and raised Burgundy to greater wealth. We're still recording. Okay. But he was a poor judge of character. His ally betrayed him on the battlefield. He was attacked from two directions, much like Richard III. His army was destroyed and Charles was killed. It was one of the pivotal moments of the 15th century. All of the things that did not happen because Charles the Bold died young and childless could have reshaped European politics for 300 years. Very likely, France and England would have become a united kingdom. But we'll never know, because the death of Charles put an abrupt end to any further possibility of English campaigns in France at all. That was it. But why did the English stop fighting the French? Charles the Bold died. While Philip the Good was reigning wisely and more or less peacefully in Burgundy, the English were tearing each other apart under the son of Henry V. Henry VI was spineless, sickly, and occasionally went insane. The Bourbon kings of France were known for having bouts of insanity, and Henry VI inherited this from his mother. The great lords of state, primarily his cousin Richard of York, administered the realm capably in his periods of incapacity. Unfortunately, every time Henry recovered, he wanted to assert his own manhood and undid all the decisions of his advisors and threw England into fresh chaos. And then he would go insane and leave his nobles to pick up the pieces. Richard of York, who had a strong claim to the throne, finally had enough and declared himself king. Richard died in battle. His army was destroyed. His second eldest son was executed after the battle by his cousin. The eldest son, Edward, gathered the remnants of the York's forces and defeated the Lancastrians in open battle, deposed the king, was crowned Edward IV at 19 years old. Edward VI was the tallest English king, 6'4". He was famous for tremendous feats of strength on and off the battlefield. He was unquestionably the most successful battle commander of any English monarch, even surpassing the records of Edward Longshanks and Richard Coeur de Lion. He was deposed through treachery by his uncle in 1470, and he retook the throne by the sword a year later. He campaigned successfully in France, although the purpose of his campaign was more to extort money from the French rather than out of any real pursuit of the crown. He may have entertained notions of actually pursuing the crown, but then, like a year later, Charles the Bold died, and Burgundy was inherited by Mary and Maximilian. When Mary and Maximilian inherited Burgundy, and then Mary died, leaving the son, Philip the Fair, to inherit Burgundy, he was a German princeling, and that dissolved any hopes of any future English-Burgundian alliance. There was no connection there anymore. Edward died young at 41, which was widely attributed to an unhealthy lifestyle of too much wine and too many women. A month after his death, a scandal came out that he had in fact married one too many women, which made his public marriage illegitimate and made bastards of his children, or at least that was the story. It's probably true. Given Edward's famous womanizing, I don't know, I believe it. His brother Richard III assumed the throne. Richard was a capable general, a very capable administrator who was fiercely loved in the north of England. But in the south, he was opposed by supporters of his brother and the remaining Lancastrians. He faced assassination attempts and open rebellions, none of which were successful, until the French crown decided that it was good business to eliminate the last direct descendant of Edward III and equipped and funded the invasion attempt of the Lancastrian, Henry Tudor. died at Bosworth, leading a cavalry charge which was reportedly took him 3 yards away from Harry Tudor. Harry was crowned Henry VII. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward V. He declared Richard III usurper, which took brass, and systematically executed every male member of the Plantagenet family, which secured his position on the throne. He was a greedy and capricious monarch who had little respect for the law, but after more than 100 years of war, England finally had peace. Another long-term ruler, the longest-term ruler in the 15th century, was John II of Aragon and Navarre. That's the northeastern third of Spain. He held the throne for 54 years. And he was widely regarded as the most treacherous and duplicitous European king of the age.
Which is saying something.
In Spain, he is still called Juan el Grande for his successes in defeating the Moors, along with his younger cousin, John II of Castile and Leon, who incidentally was also the cousin of Henry V. And he also arranged the marriage of his son to his cousin's daughter. That's kind of icky, but that's dynastic politics. But it led to the unification of Spain. On the other hand, to everyone else in Europe, he is referred to as John the Faithless. He robbed, betrayed, and murdered his oldest son over the course of a 10-year civil war. That set the stage for a second 10-year-long civil war later. The reason was that he was the king of Aragon and his wife was the king of Navarre. Or his wife was the heir of Navarre. While he was married to her, he was the king of both territories. But when she died, her son, his oldest son, had the right to become king of Navarre in his own right. But John didn't want to give it up, or won. So instead of giving his son what he was due, he murdered his son and just kept it. For 50 years, Western Spain was beggared by conflict and turned Spain into the next thing at a country of arms, a country at arms, full of no one but soldiers, hardened by a very long, very cruel, very personal conflict. The one good thing to come out of that 54-year reign was his son Ferdinand, whom he married to Isabella of Castile. Between them, Ferdinand and Isabella were the king and queen of Aragon, Castile, Leon, Naples, Sicily, and Valencia. They were true co-monarchs. Their motto was Tanto monte tanto, Isabella como Fernando. You know the phrase tantamount? It means the same thing as. That was what they were saying. Tanto monte tanto. One is the same as the other. They transformed the various states and kingdoms of Iberia into the Reino de España, a true kingdom of Spain, which had not existed prior. They spent the last quarter of the 15th century conquering all the last bits of it. The fortress city of Granada fell in 1491. The Moors were expelled. The Moors were heavily taxed and given limited rights, which was considered enlightened at the time. The Jews were expelled or obliged to convert. Again, we frown on it now, but at the time, giving the option was considered enlightened. England had expelled all Jews centuries earlier, whether they wanted to convert and stay or not. And then the monarchs started rebuilding. They had many children, few of them survived. Their daughter, they married the king of Portugal, and their son, John, and daughter, Joanna, or I suppose Juan and Juana, they promised in marriage to the children of Joanna married the son, Philip the Handsome, who was now the Duke of Burgundy, who, if you remember, was named after his grandfather, Philip the Good of Burgundy. Their son John, named after both grandfathers, married Margaret of Austria. Both couples married in 1497 in a double wedding. Juan and Margaret would inherit all of Spain, while Philip and Joanna, or Juana, would inherit Austria, Burgundy, and presumably the Holy Roman Empire. Both couples were reportedly enthusiastically passionate about each other, which entertained their future subjects. But John died at 19 years old, 6 months into marriage, leaving a pregnant 17-year-old widow who later lost the child at birth, which left the entire empire Spain, Burgundy, Germany, Austria, the largest empire Europe had ever seen since the fall of Rome, into the hands of Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad. It's appropriate that the 15th century should end on the birth of a new empire because it's the middle of the century saw the death of an old one. That was the Roman Empire. We call them Byzantines, but they didn't. They called themselves the Romans. They called themselves Romanoi. Their emperor was an Augustus, the princes were Caesars, their assembly was the Senate. They thought they were Roman. Emperor Constantine Paleologos, Constantine XI, was the last Augustus of the Romans. He was crowned emperor to an empire that was little more than a city, but it was the city, Constantinople. It had become, again, the largest and most powerful city on earth. They actually had reasonably friendly relations with the Ottoman Empire, which is relative since the Ottomans swallowed their empire. Murad II was actually invited into the city to arbitrate dynastic disputes. So, but Murad died, and his 19-year-old son Mehmed came to the throne, and Mehmed wanted Constantinople. He had no particular animus to the people. In fact, he offered to relocate them out of the city into a new city that he would build in the Arcadian Highlands. He would build them a new Constantinople. He just wanted the city itself and its location on the Golden Horn to more successfully prosecute his invasions into Eastern Europe. But the city was all the Romans had, and they would not move. In desperation, Emperor Constantine signed the Treaty of Florence, agreeing to the reunification of Catholic and Orthodox churches, which is the source of our own Eastern Rite Catholic rite of the faction of Catholicism today. He did this in order to gain the support of the Catholic West. He got a few Venetians, a few gentlemen, not much more than 150 people. Constantine had 7,000 troops against somewhere between 60 and 120,000 Turks. The result was inevitable. After a year-long siege, on Tuesday, May the 29th, 1543, the Turks overwhelmed the defenders at the gate of Chersias, which was known to the Romanoi as the Gate of the Dead because of the graveyard outside. Constantine was still fighting on the walls when the Turks stormed the city, and his last recorded words were, "Alas, the city has fallen, and I am still alive." He removed all of his imperial regalia so he could not be singled out for capture, and led his men in one last hopeless charge where he died. All of Christendom mourned. There was a deep, guilty regret that someone hadn't done something, anything, to prevent the fall of the city. I've talked before about how the next 50 years are full of songs and poems and even novels about the fantasy of what could have been done. Mehmed the Conqueror did eventually allow many of the Greeks to flee the city after the conquest. Most of them went to Italy. And many historians are becoming increasingly convinced it was those Romanoi who imported ancient or classical Roman knowledge of literature, science, and mathematics that were the impetus for the Italian Renaissance in the middle of the 15th century. If you've been paying attention, you notice I didn't talk about anyone in Italy because there's nothing to talk about. I also didn't talk about the Nordic states. There's nothing to talk about. Europe in the 15th century pivoted around Burgundy, basically. Italy was backwater ruled by bankers and mercenaries, also the church. But in the 16th century, it was Italy who was the shining star of fashion and culture, and all of Europe orbited it. So that's the landscape of the late Middle Ages. I hope that's given you a sense, no matter where your persona is from, of what the person into whose shoes you are stepping would have felt about their place in the world, about where their people fit in history, what they were aiming towards, or what they weren't.